Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Hanobi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator at Redwind Consulting, and I'll be the host for this call. Today we'll be covering documentation to manage your Tribal Transitional Housing Program. We are joined today by Raquel DeHerrera.
Hello.
Raquel has been with Redwind for 3 years. Her bachelor's in sociology, and she is currently getting her master's in sociology. She has been a trainer for the National Tribal Advocate Center and has presented at Redwind Consulting's Creating Sister Space. And also, she has experienced working with tribal housing authorities and Native programs nationally with strategic planning, capacity building, trauma-informed care, violence, collaboration, policy and protocol development, and harm reduction. I will now turn it over to her.
Hi, thank you, Hanobi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all taking the time to join me for today's webinar. I am the Program Director of the Haseya Advocate Program. We are a project of Redwind Consulting. We're a local advocate program here in Colorado Springs, serving our Native community here. So with that, we work under a couple of grants. Some of the services we provide are a crisis response, so what that is immediate safety planning, kind of assessing needs, risk assessments, emergency shelter through hotels, our referrals, and some emergency financial assistance. And we also have a transitional housing program. We're funded through OVW, and with that we provide rental subsidies. So what those kind of look like are we help with a portion of the rent, and it's tiered, so it starts off at a certain amount and then it just goes down every 3 months, and that's kind of based on family size and household. We also do relocation assistance, so with that we can help with security deposits, application fees, utility assistance to start up, and then sometimes moving assistance. Of course, we only have a certain amount to kind of allocate for all of those, so we definitely outsource to other programs. We were fortunate enough to have a local moving company that donates their time and helps our participants move their stuff into their new home. We also do supportive services, so we help with budgeting, referring out to workforce center programs, and things like that. So for today's webinar, I'm going to talk about documentation in a transitional housing program. So with that, kind of who's responsible for what is needed to be documented and who should have access to that documentation, the what of, what needs to be documented and where should that documentation be stored and for how long, and when you should document. So we definitely don't want to over-document or under-document for specific reasons. And then how we can create structures that we can put in place to ensure that needed information is being documented. So please feel free to ask questions or make comments at any time. I'll periodically look at the comment section because I know sometimes questions are better asked when in the moment and when we're in context, but no, we'll have a question and comment portion at the end if you have any questions. So, and just thank you for joining me. So to get started, I think the first thing that's really important is thinking about the definition of what documentation means. Sometimes it's just simple and easy to look at the definition, and it simply provides another way to look at what we are trying to do. So a material that provides official information or evidence or that serves as a record, the process of classifying and annotating text, photographs, and so on. The first part of that definition, material that provides official information or evidence or that serves as a record, is going to be important for our work. It's going to apply mostly to us because we want to really provide official information and evidence that serves as a record for the work that we're doing. As transitional housing programs, and I would argue for all professional settings, if it's not on record or shown as having been done, then some could argue that it basically was not done or that you can't prove that it was in fact done. And kind of what I mean by that, let's say, for example, an advocate puts on their timesheet that they met with a participant at a workforce center, development center, while also they are getting reimbursed for those miles. If there's not an official way to document that that service was provided and that request was made, then how can we justify that to our funders, or how will they know that this is true? So even though we know that our advocates are awesome, and we know that that work definitely is being done, we just need official documentation that's on record demonstrating that that was in fact done. So we'll need structures in place to help in demonstrating that. So as advocates and program directors, we can get incredibly busy, especially if we're a small organization. So the Haseya Advocate Program, we have 2 part-time, 1 full-time advocates, and then me, so it can get very busy. There are days where there barely are anyone in the office. So when we think about creating structures, we also want them to be easily accessible for advocates to use. We definitely want to create ways in which we document that will be conducive or most likely possible that advocates are going to use it and do so. If we have too many structures and expectations, it can kind of overburden advocates and kind of defeat the purpose of what we're doing. So while also increasing the likelihood of over-documenting or under-documenting if it's not getting done. So we really want to think as we create structures in place that we are making sure that it's really likely to get used and is feasible. Something else to note when creating new structures for documenting, give it time. I think for new advocate programs or even, long-time advocate programs, we're constantly learning as we go. Something definitely comes up and we're like, oh, we didn't think necessarily about this situation. So give it time. Change is hard. I don't like change, so I'm always more inclined to say things are not working. But if you give it some adequate time, you might see that it does work. And then if it doesn't, you'll know more as to why it does not work and can kind of lead to better structures. So using some of that time to really evaluate what's working and what's not working. So getting into the why of documentation, first and foremost is grant compliance. And this is very important because we want to keep our funding, we don't want to lose our funding, and if we're not in compliance, we risk losing our funding. So an example I like to use with grant compliance is really OVW's expectation of confidentiality and the release of information procedure. So one way that you can have documentation that provides a way that you are in compliance of confidentiality is how your release of information looks. Does it demonstrate that this is, requires informed consent of the participant? Is it a time-limited release of information? So some of those ways that you can demonstrate that you're in compliance is with, simple forms that you use. So just thinking about that and what your release of information form looks like and how does that demonstrate that you are in compliance with your grant. Another important thing is tracking the work being done. So again, how do you prove that in fact you did the work that you said you were going to do? And we at Haseya Advocate Program, we have a tracking services form that we use. And I didn't put it up here, but if you want a copy of it just to look at and see how that looks, please feel free to email me and I can send you that form. But what our services tracking form looks like is I really looked at the report and what we said we were going to do, what we're allowed to do with our transitional housing program, and I broke it down by sections. So we have a housing assistance component, and so that includes our monthly rental subsidies. And then we have an economic advocacy component, and so I break it down and what that means. So that's review of current economic status, help in securing or stabilizing income, so outsourcing and using employment programs, public assistance, resume development, whether that's bus passes to help get to interviews or to the job development center, child care stipends for apartment search interviews, and things like that. That's part of economic advocacy. Another component we have is housing advocacy. So that's reaching out to landlords because we don't have units of our own. We have to utilize what's here in the community. So really maintaining relationships with landlords, doing the housing search assistance and research, securing rental units, and accompaniment, so going with participants to look at units and see if this is something that will work for them. Another big component is recovery from violence and safety. So this is identifying and accessing traditional healing options, dynamic safety planning for each household member, and help with assessing whether housing is safe. So one thing that we use that's really not an official document, but just some things to consider when looking for an apartment or looking for a place, and how does it compare to what your safety needs are. Another component is relocation assistance, so that's with the lease application fees, security deposits, things like that. And then there's a section for referrals, so if we refer out to our resource agencies and things like that. So I have that on the top of our form, and then on the next box below it, there's a date, a section to write the date and some notes, and then each box has an abbreviation, and then you can check box each one to see kind of what you did to track the services that you did as an advocate. So if someone comes in and they need help finding an apartment, and then they also need a ride to their job interview, then you would put that date and you would check the box under economic advocacy and housing advocacy. So that's just an easy way to track your services and track the work that's being done, and it's official records that you keep in the file that demonstrates the work that's being done. So then to continue demonstrating why we document is demonstrating further program needs. So this kind of helps answer the question, and I think your grant writer will love you for this documentation because you have the quote-unquote evidence needed for what your program needs. So it helps demonstrate through numbers, through past needs, what your program needs for future funding. One example I'm finding is, along with relocation assistance, we didn't really add for pet deposits. And so this is something that, through our application process where participants can write their needs, part of it is the pet deposit. So this is just a way through our application of saying, this is what we couldn't provide in the future. This is maybe what we need to look for and ask for funding. So that's really important to document some of those needs, and then also to demonstrate the participants' needs. So those two kind of go hand in hand. But it answers also the question of why you worked on what you did with your participant. So if you did something one day and basically how you record why you did that is through application, through goals. We have a goals worksheet, and I can add that if you want that in an email as well. This is what tracks what participants need ongoing in our program. And the goals worksheet has 4 sections for housing, safety, economic, future goals, and healing. And then each one, under one of those, we have a short-term goal, a midterm goal, and a long-term goal. And with that, there are steps that you take to reach your goal, what you'll need to reach your goal, potential challenges or barriers, and then how do you determine if you move forward on that goal. And that's kind of how we track what the work that we're doing, why we're doing it, and demonstrating participants' needs as you further go on in your program. So using that, this is why we document. And then again, this kind of goes with further program needs, but information for future grants to be written. So, and not only for future needs, but to support all the great work you're doing. So it shows the effectiveness of your program. It's showing what is working in your program. It shows that, how successful, the economic resources have been, whether that's financial classes, whether that's cooking classes that your program is providing, or support groups. It really demonstrates the effectiveness of your program, and also while demonstrating what you still might need for your program. And this one's really big for program directors, reports for when you need to do your report. Having information is critical for your reports because we don't follow advocates every time they're meeting with someone, or we're not really walking through with them as they're doing their work. So when it comes to reporting and time for the program director to really report what it is that we are working on, what we've done in that reporting period, we need structures that we can pull from that will be easy. For example, it's really important, let's say someone asks about a past report from a year ago and they have a question on why you reported something. You can easily go back and be able to pull the documentation that justifies why you reported what it is that you reported. And so it makes it so much easier also to do the reports. If you have systems in place that, advocates know reporting month is coming, I've got all my documentation in place that you need, so here you go, and all you have to do is go through all of those things and pull them for your report. So these are just some reasons why we document, and I find the most critical. So thinking about just some tools that I use when creating structures for making documentation easier and documenting what it is that we need, I look specifically at the special conditions from our grant. And these great resources you just have simply at the tip of your fingertips, so you can just look at your special conditions and you can see what is expected of you. Are we demonstrating that we're following special conditions of our grant? One example I have is in our special conditions, there's an encouragement of policies to ban text messaging while driving. And so we can put that in our policies while also having advocates sign a document promising not to text while driving. And that indicates that we are aware of our special conditions, that we are in compliance of that, or that we are encouraging that, and it's just a way to have that on record to say that we are in compliance. And of course there's so many, I think there's like 30 or 40 for us, but just really looking through and being familiar with your special conditions to make sure that you are documenting what you need to document. You have things in your policies and protocols that are compliant within your grant. That will be important. Another thing that I specifically helped me when I first started out as an advocate and then moved up to being a program director, what helped me kind of create some systems and structures in place was looking at a report that was already done. So that way you know what you need to report on. So for an example, household size and demographics. We need to know each person in the household, their gender, and their age. And so in the program intake, we put that information in there so that it's there and you have that for each report. And so that's really good information to look at of, okay, what do we need to report on? What did I have a hard time reporting on? Couldn't really find that information, and how do we make sure that we have ways in which we can document that and put in those reports. So, and then also another great way to use the report is having a better idea of the scope of your work. So when we first started, we had, for the tracking services, we had so many other things that we really didn't work on in our grant. And so with that, it was really confusing because as an advocate, it was like, can we do this or can we not do it? But it's in our tracking services, so we must be able to do it. So in reality, you really just want to use what is specific to your program. So what is specific to your grant, what is specific to the work that you said you were going to do, and use that for ways in creating structures of how you document. And it's also really beneficial, I think, for advocates to have a copy of the report so they can see kind of what is being tracked, what work that they need to report on, why this documentation needs to happen. Sometimes I think it can be hard as advocates. It's like, why do we have to do all of this? It's already really hectic and busy. It's hard to create, all this other work. Why am I doing it? So if they have an understanding of why we really are asking for them to document it, reports are a great way to show that. Another important resource is a grant narrative. So this kind of explains what did we say we're going to do, and then how do we demonstrate that that is in fact what we are going to do. So again, just the scope of your work. And that also helps with writing policy and protocol. So you definitely don't want to add anything that you said you weren't going to do if it's not written in there. And then policy and protocols are great because it's great to determine, do our policies and protocols conform, with our documentation structures. So did we acknowledge in our policies we would not ask for certain information, but we're asking it in our application, or we're putting that information and asking participants to put that in our application. So we want to make sure that our policy and protocol add up with our structures that we have in place for documentation. We definitely don't, in our policy, that's where we use basically our philosophical guide of our work. And so if we really emphasize that it's not important for us to, a prime example would be asking the offenders or the abusers information. If we say that we are, not going to be re-traumatizing, and of course this goes with safety and additional, and we can go on to, I have some other ways to kind of navigate that, but going back, if we said we're not, doesn't philosophically meet our standards of our program, we want to make sure that our documentation structures are not saying otherwise. And then lastly, just thinking about current forms that are being used. It's great to evaluate those periodically to see if they're working. So if you find that you as an advocate or as a program director, things aren't being completed, we can ask, is it too complicated? Is it burdensome? Does it not make sense to do? Is it accessible? Often, as an advocate, our work is on the go most of the time. So, is it not easily accessible and complement the work that we do? And I think it's great to do this after a reporting period because you use kind of your documentation structures to help you with your report. And so if you find that something didn't work very well, you can evaluate that and see how effective or not effective it was. And it's fresh in your memory. So, and then you can see kind of why it didn't work for what you were supposed to report on. And then it's a great, just as advocates, to kind of, if it doesn't work for you, to make sure that you demonstrate that to the program director or executive director, that it's, there might be more efficient ways to do it. I think that's important because, tracking the services that you're providing is mostly done by, you as advocates. So definitely express that if it's not working. And then as a program director, make sure that you're periodically asking advocates if it's working or if there's something that they're not quite sure why they're documenting or how it needs to be documented. that's important to kind of keep that communication open. And with the current forms, when you evaluate them periodically, maybe do it as an advocate meeting and pulling all of your documentation structures together and see, is this working? Is this moving along with our program? Do we see that we're going in a different direction? Those are great ways to kind of think about creating new structures, and then what you'll need to kind of determine what you need in place, or what, if anything's working efficiently. So just some things to keep in mind. You definitely want to keep in mind that of what services you are providing and what you should report on. So you definitely don't want to document thinking about, and just the ways that you document. So making sure that if you said you were going to provide housing assistance and rental subsidies, how are you demonstrating that you are doing that? And how do you have systems in place where you're working with the finance department to make sure that you're documenting that? If you said that you were going to help with recovery from violence and safety, how do you demonstrate that you are, in fact, safety planning with each participant? And like I said, we use a goals worksheet, and that kind of helps that we use when we meet with a participant once a month to kind of demonstrate that, and that the services that we provide and how we kind of document that in our tracking form. So definitely thinking about those things. Is it necessary to document these services? I think this is really important, because if we think about it, do we necessarily have to report where, let's say, we refer to? And of course, your grant, I think for our report, it does ask, how many referrals have you made to mental health? How many referrals have you made to a food pantry, food assistance, or things like that? So you might have to document where you are referring to, but then just kind of think about how you're documenting those services. So, if you referred someone for just mental health, thinking about if these things can be subpoenaed, how would that look, and how do you put that in a context? If somebody is, trying to get custody, full custody of their children, and their file from your program is subpoenaed, and it says, oh, she needs mental health, so she's obviously not fit to be a mom, the defendant's lawyer can, the abuser's lawyer can use that to try and, misconstrue things. But if we put, just referred because recovery from violence, and, putting that into context, how do you kind of put that in there without making it look a certain way or be misconstrued in a different way? So just thinking about, is it necessary to document these services? And this helps with over-documenting. We don't want to document everything that we don't need to do, because then that just turns into a possible mess. So really important to think about that. And then another thing is just, again, is it effective for advocates to use? Is it too long? So our tracking services form, there's a section for notes, and it's just a simple one line. You definitely don't want to leave a blank space of, really long, to where advocates are going to be more inclined to over-document and fill up this space. I'm reminded of, when you're in school and, your teachers give you a big space to write your answer, and you feel so compelled to fill up the whole box, and it's just fluff, So thinking about that is, you don't want to provide too big of a space, because then you'll use it, and that leads to possible over-documentation. So just being clear on, is it effective for advocates to use, time efficient? So again, how can we make it more efficient? If it takes too much time to do, advocates will be less likely to use it. So another example for time efficiency, I think, when we first started, it was, with 2 advocates, it could be very busy and not enough time to do paperwork. So we are now closed on Tuesdays because we wanted time to do paperwork, and that we're just closed for walk-ins. So if someone has an appointment, and I mean, advocates are still available to do that, but we wanted to make sure that there was enough time for documentation to get done, just to kind of keep track on, are the files updated, are your services that you've tracked up to date, and things like that. So just thinking about ways in which you can create time and space for advocates or yourself. If you can't do that as an organization, you're an advocate, maybe think about, taking blocks of your day or chunks of your day and getting caught up on your documentation and files. So as you think about creating structures, you definitely want to make sure it's time efficient and that it's not overburdening with unnecessary things to do. And then thinking about how can it help with the organization. Really thinking about, and we'll talk about how we can organize our documentation in ways that will be organized and be in a place that we all know where to access it. But I think this is also a way in how you can help organize the work that you're supposed to be doing. So one form that I created was really just kind of the basic services checklist that the advocate does. So, from the first day, along with the application and your tracking services form, you bring the service checklist, and it's kind of like, hey, did you get the application? Was it signed? Did you talk about confidentiality? Did you talk about mandated reporting? Is there an interview scheduled? Was that completed? Were they informed of their decision? And so on. So it just kind of goes through kind of an outline of how the work gets done. And so that helps with organization, I think, especially when things can happen, and it doesn't have to happen A, B, C, in that direct order, but it's just making sure that, okay, did we, in fact, schedule an interview with the participant who filled, who is requesting our transitional housing services. So it's just a way to help keep organized. And I definitely, if you are interested in these forms, please feel free to email me and I can send them all to you, and you can see if that works or compare or use them as guides. But you can really think about how you document as ways of keeping you organized. Even on the back of our application, we have a section where it's basically for office use only, and it records the date the application was received, if they were accepted in transitional housing, and then if yes, when were they notified, date they were accepted in, are they placed on a waiting list, and then if not, the reason for denial. And this is just a way to document why you, and justify why you decided, whether this person was a great fit for your program or why they weren't. So we really want to think about these are ways to keep you organized and also to justify the decisions that you make in your program. And so moving on to supporting confidentiality, and all of the work that we do, it's critical that we're protecting confidentiality. So in a way that we do that is we have, so let's say someone's requesting relocation assistance for a security deposit. We have a form where the participant will fill that out and request, and it stays in the advocacy department, in our locked file cabinet, in our finance file cabinet, and then we then, as advocates, will fill out a staff financial request form. And so what that looks like is we have what it is that we're requesting, and the amount and the funding source, and then we sign our name as an advocate. Then we get that approved by a program director or the executive director, and then that does not have any confidential information. It only has their code name, and that's how that gets submitted into the bookkeeping. It's under the code name, and that's how we pass that on to the finance department. So we really want to create ways in which we have documentation and we have, the information, but we're protecting confidentiality. So if there's ever an audit, or when, I shouldn't say if, but when there is, when the bookkeeper, is like, oh, we have this request, whoever is asking for that information, of course, we're definitely going to say this is confidential information. We're not going to show you that, but we have a way in which we can demonstrate there was a request by a participant, and this is why we did. This is why we paid the security deposit. So that's just a way of thinking about keeping and supporting confidentiality. And then you're going to want to look at what works in your community, because I know oftentimes some programs are, they work with human services, or they work in other, with other organizations. So you want to think about how you create your communication with others who really shouldn't have confidential information, but they still need some form of information for the work that they do, and then along with collaborating with you. So just thinking about what will work in your community. Another thing to keep in mind is, how does this impact survivors and victims? And this can be on a couple of levels, where do you really need to document something? So let's say, as an advocate, you're working with a participant and they miss an appointment with you. You scheduled an appointment and they missed it. And so in your services tracking form, you say missed appointment. And then let's say you're out for that day or another day and you're sick, but that person comes in, and so your fellow advocate's going to work with this participant. And they look at the tracking form and say, oh, they missed an appointment. That kind of already creates a bias, or kind of gives you a misperception of who that person is. And so really thinking about how that impacts how we work with participants, how other advocates will work with them if we're not there. And maybe they missed an appointment because they had an interview that they got asked to go to, and they prioritized, meeting with you or going to that job interview. And so making sure that when you document things, and if you have to, again, context is everything. So how do you document that, and how is that going to impact participants in your program? So just thinking about those things, but then also really thinking about the application process, thinking about all of the structures. Yes, we need documentation, but are we asking, in several different forms for the same information? We don't want to overload. Even looking at our application, is it longer than it needs to be? Are there things in our application that we're asking them to fill out and we really don't need them to fill out? So again, talking about information on abusers. Sometimes thinking about, and I always think about, oh my gosh, if this gets subpoenaed, I always think about, possible negative outcomes. So just thinking about, if on our application we're asking for abuser information, if they get that wrong and it gets subpoenaed and they're like, well, how do we even know this is that, because this is the person, because they misidentified. So really thinking about the purpose of why we need it. I also understand in a transitional housing program, we are meeting participants at their house. We're driving around with them, as they access other resources. And so it might be really important for you as an advocate to have that information. So then you might have to think about how do you get that information? Where do you store it? Is it important to have? So just thinking about how things impact survivors and victims or our participants. Another thing that I think is important is as long as you don't have a lot of confidential information, I know when I first started, I would have pages upon pages of notes when I was working with a participant of all these things, and then it would stay in their file, and it really, there was no confidential information in it. It was just to help me as I'm working with participants. So that could stay with you in your own notebook, and I think that you definitely have to determine that for safety-wise, because sometimes even situations you can people can find out who it is that you're talking about if someone gets access to your notebooks or things like that. But just really think about, do all of these things have to be in their file, and how it will impact them if it is. And then, another thing to keep in mind is their consistency. So are we creating too many structures at different times? So are we starting something and then saying, no, this is how we're going to do it now? And is that happening a lot? Because then that kind of creates not really knowing exactly what it is anymore that you are supposed to be documenting, and can be frustrating as people are trying to do their jobs and not really understand what it is that they need to be documenting or doing. So think about consistency. Like I said at the beginning, give it a while before you determine whether it works or doesn't work, because a lot of times it can be really hard to adjust to change. And so maybe something does work, you just have to get over the change aspect and then see how that works. And that kind of creates more consistency. So if you create something that's new, say, okay, we're going to give 2 months and see how it works, and then have a consistent every time you do that 2 months. We're going to try it, or this reporting period, we're going to try it. That way it's consistent. So if there's change, we know that we learn as we go sometimes, and so just making sure that there's some consistency within that, so that way it doesn't get too hectic or frustrating in the program. So just some ways. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Question?
Let's take a moment to see if anyone has any questions.
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. Yes, does anyone have any questions?
You can either raise the hand button up in the corner, or you can type it in the chat.
I always forget. I get on a roll, and then it's like, oh, yes, questions. If anybody has specific questions to their program, or what kind of they find is hard for documentation, feel free to. It doesn't have to be specific to what we just talked about, but maybe if there's specific documentation questions in your own program.
All right, well, I'm not seeing anyone, so I believe we can
Okay,
move
and
on.
then feel free, feel free if you find something, and I'll try and look at the chat box every now and then. So moving on to just the how you store your the information that you need, or just ways in which you can organize all of your documentation. Redwind really loves binders. And at first, I'm like an organized chaos kind of person where I know where everything is, but being here, I learned binders are amazing. They really can be a great resource to track and support the financial and progress reports, and then as well as supporting documents for your grant requirements. So I keep a binder for our financial reports. So the bookkeeper person gives me monthly reports of kind of where we're at with our financial for our program. That helps when you look at, okay, where is this person on their subsidy this month? How much did we pay for this month? Where are we kind of going? Is this person getting ready to exit the program? And things like that, so you can look back, and that information is right there. Progress reports, the same thing. Each reporting period, or each report is in a binder, and you can look at that have that in a binder, as well as keeping up with emails from those in your grant who kind of send questions or any contact that you have. I keep those in binders just to kind of keep that as a record. And then also binders help keeping track of meetings. So specifically not with our transitional housing program, but with our our crisis response, we have to have 4 information booths for community events, and we have to have education groups. So we have binders that are specific to those requests. So if we had a community event, we'll put a flyer in there, as well as information on how much materials we brought with us, how many we came with, and then how many we left with, those type of things. And if we don't have a flyer, we'll take a picture of ourselves at the community event center or a community event that we went to. So that's all in a binder. So that's all like official information that we have in our binders. So keeping track of meetings. We also, with our transitional housing program, we have to do monthly meetings with the Continuum of Care here in Colorado Springs. So with that, we put the agendas in that binder to demonstrate that we were in fact there. We are doing the work that we said we were going to do and that we are funded to do. So we have a binder for that, and each advocate knows that we have to keep that documentation. So, and it's in a place where we all have access. So it's just there. We just put it in there, whoever goes to that meeting that month. So if you have education groups you do, or support groups, or outreach, definitely if you do outreach, some of the supportive documents that you might have are time and date and the person you met with and their signature in there. If you brought any materials with you for that outreach, those are great ways to keep organized and to keep in a binder. Budgets are great, especially as you look at what are we working with here, what's our budget right now, and then MOUs. So if you have a memorandum of understanding with another organization, and you said that you were going to have that in your grant narrative and in your goals and objectives, definitely want to keep that in somewhere where you have that in an organized way. So the binders are a great resource to have just to keep things in certain places. And so thinking about why, I think the most important thing to track is if our participants are fully, partially, and not served. And I think along with that, you kind of have to determine what your funder determines is fully or partially not served. And then how do you determine that in your organization? So, so just thinking about ways in which you can use, what structures you can use to demonstrate if someone was fully, partially, or not served. And so we used, what we use are, of course, the service tracking forms, but the first part is in our application. We ask kind of what their needs are, what they're asking us to help with. And so those are, how we determine, did we fully serve them in what they were asking? Were we even, is that something our program can do? So we use the application, and then as we move further down and they're in our program, we use our goals and objectives or our goals worksheet that we work with them once a month, and I kind of talked about that, how there's housing goals, healing goals. So in our program, we really focus on providing cultural support. We are in an urban setting here in Colorado Springs. Yes.
Static and feedback from your line?
Oh, it's probably, I put paper on the speaker. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just going through my goals.
Yeah.
Is it better?
So much better. Thank you.
Okay, great. So just thinking about our goals. So we have, we are in an urban setting. So, one thing that we really try to focus on is reaching out to, our traditional healers here or to events that are culturally specific. So these are ways in which, we can determine if that's something that they want access to, if they want us to do. That's kind of what tracks if they're fully, partially, or not served, are kind of what is in their goals. One specific thing that just an example, someone put in their healing goal was the short-term goal was to attend one yoga class. And then, we ask what steps is it going to take to reach that, or, what will you need to do, or what will you need to reach your goal, challenges, barriers, and those type of things. And of course, we can access, okay, childcare was an issue for them, that they couldn't participate in that. So then, we had to justify how do we use some of that money for childcare assistance. And part of that that's part of their healing process. That's something that they need to heal from the violence. So just thinking about that, thinking about your goals and how you demonstrate it is going to be very important as you determine who's fully, partially, and not served. And so again, tracking services for each contact, that also will help with tracking, with determining fully, partially, or not served information from application, and then the goals worksheet. So that's going to be those three things. And of course, it's going to look different for your program. And if you have certain questions, like if you find that you are having a hard time determining that, or there aren't structures in your program to determine that, please feel free to email me, and we can kind of talk through like what will work in your program. I know not everybody has rental subsidy or scatter kind of layout for their program. So then just going into documenting what's only needed. We don't want to over-document, and for confidentiality reasons and other reasons, notes and other information should be kept to a minimum. So thinking about limit space on the form for notes, which we've already talked about. If you put a big spot for people to use, then it's probably going to be overfilled. Documentation only that allows for an advocate to effectively work with the participants. So if you need certain information to guide you through your future work, then definitely consider putting that in. But if it's not something that you need to work with the participant, then I would say don't document that unless you have to for reporting or things like that. And then again, reflect. How is this information going to look if it's used, or how it's going to look if it's subpoenaed. So again, just making sure that putting things into context as well when you document will be important. And then is this information required to be in the participant file? One thing that we have is kind of a layout of what our file should look like. So we definitely need the application, we need the interview, we need form, we need the intake form, a contact information form, and so on. And at the end I'll kind of talk about the forms that we have, but you need all of these forms in there and really nothing else. So and then the lease, of course, we want to keep that in there, but definitely only keeping what is required to be in the participant file. Again, with notes, if it's not extreme confidential, if it's not confidential information, and it's just something like a note of, oh, I need to call the code name, then you don't have to document that in the file. And then thinking about access to files, you want to limit that. So we definitely, only advocates and the program director has a key to the file cabinet, of course, executive director. But really the only people who should have access to confidential files are advocates or those working with the participants. So for our financial department, if they need financial documents, they will ask us, and then we can determine, we have ways in which we can get that information and keep it confidential. Information is on a need-to-know basis. So, if as an advocate you're having a hard time, you're not sure what to do or where to go in the work that you are working with a participant, we definitely encourage that you talk to the program director instead of reaching out to other advocates. I really think that, as you're working with a participant, I treat confidentiality as, I really honor that. And I think for, participants, it's good to know, and we want to kind of reiterate that, your story is your story, and you get to share with whom you want to share that with. And so it would be really hard if you're, if no one needs to know the information and you're just sharing it freely. So just think about that and how you make sure that information is only on a need-to-know basis. And then we use on the front of our files, and I did put this in the PowerPoint, but it's a tracking sticky label that kind of tracks who accessed the file and why they accessed it and when. So here, this is kind of what it looks like. And it's a sticky label, and we put it on the front, and there's their code, and then you put the date. And so if I'm working with a participant and the file that I access, or the document I accessed was the tracking services form, I'm going to put the tracking services form, and then I'm going to put to track services, and then I'll sign it. And so you kind of just, it provides an extra layer, and also it demonstrates how serious we take confidentiality, and that no one really should be getting in the files without, a real purpose. So this is what we have on there. And it really helps with just kind of, keeping it on track, even when you think about when you review your files, I haven't tracked my services. Let me go get my notebook and put all the services that we've done. So that's just something, a little tool that we use. And so, again, going with reviewing files, we want to review those periodically. And so this is just to ensure that there's no over or under documenting. This can be done by program directors, but also you as an advocate, just review your files periodically just to make sure that you are up to date in all the things that you are needed to do. So this is just to help with what's working, what's not working, maybe the forms. Definitely when you review them periodically, you will see what isn't getting done and if that's just kind of a structural problem. And then it's important, especially as, we're fairly new. We started last year in our advocacy, so, some forms, we thought worked, and then we kind of had to change them. Or I think one of our forms, it was just the easiest thing to overlook, but it was a signature. I think it was our intake where the participant had to sign, and we didn't have that on there. So then, of course, making sure that appropriate and current forms are being used and being kept in the files. So, making sure that no one's continuing to use that form where there was not a place for a participant to sign. So that's important to just keep in mind, that all the forms that are being used are appropriate and current forms. And then to ensure unnecessary information is not being stored in the files. So thinking about, there was, if you're working with a resume, do you need to keep a copy of their resume if, they have it and they no longer want you to hold it? And of course that's going to change. Sometimes participants want you to keep something in their file because it's safer there. And so of course you find ways in which how to do that, but you want to let them know, are you comfortable if this ever gets subpoenaed for this to be able to be accessed? So just ensuring that unnecessary information is not being stored in the files. So, and then you want to do that periodically. I would say, as advocates doing that, weekly, having a date, a set time where you do your files every week. Like for us, it's Tuesday. It's a great way to just ensure that you have time to kind of review your files. And then program directors, just however often you think that you want to do them, review them, it's just great to do. So then again, just protecting confidentiality. So you want to separate forms from financial departments to advocacy. You want to make sure that any documentation or any forms that need to be seen by anyone other than advocates, you have code names, that there's no identifying information on there. Storing your confidential information with advocacy. I know sometimes some programs have a hard time because other programs are, want or feel like they are privileged to having confidential information. I think especially if you are kind of connected to a child protection program, they feel like they kind of, they get privileged access to that. And you can always say, no, this is what our grant says, going back to documentation and policies, but definitely keeping that information within advocacy and only with advocacy. And then using code names. So what we use is we have a log that we use for each year, and there's a list of, I don't know how many plants, but a lot of plants. And then we go by the year, the month, and then the plant. So if someone came in today, we would put 1809 and then a code name. So let's a plant. So that's how we would use that code name. And then just separating financial requests and participant financial requests, kind of talked about that. That's kind of an easy way to do that where you're protecting information. So keeping that, and we also keep the lease because we do rental subsidies. We have to have a copy of the lease on hand. We keep that in our file. We don't give that to the financial department. And that's kind of our participant financial request is the lease. And then we, of course, fill out the staff financial request monthly. And that lease is kind of what supports the reason for that subsidy for that month. And so I'll leave it with, I really kind of want to go over our forms. But if anybody has questions or comments right now or anything, we can leave that time now. I don't know if anyone has questions or if they are kind of struggling with working with other programs in their department. And I'll just kind of go over some of the forms that we have just to give you ideas of ways in which we document things. So we have, the application, so some of the information that's on there. We talked about in the back how we document if they're approved or not approved. And then I created an interview guide, and I think this helps determine eligibility and justifies whether they were accepted or not. So part of that interview process is just a form that's filled out by those who are doing the interview, and it just kind of has information on our program. We're asking more specifics that really aren't on our application. So what that kind of looks like is just, we ask, in our eligibility application, our applicant must be homeless or in need of transitional housing as a result of a situation of domestic violence. So, and we go over that, and, if they say yes, we click yes. They're 18 years or older. So all of that, and then we have, eligibility criteria. So you're going to want to look at what determines eligibility in your program and put that in. You document that. It's an easy way to document, kind of gathering more information about current living situations, things like that. And again, I can provide copies if you want to look at it. if it gives you ideas. Again, this is just a way to help determine eligibility and justifies if they were accepted. We also have a rental assistance agreement. So I use this from NNEDV, the National Network to End Domestic Violence. They're our TA provider, and I just kind of used their template document, but I did change that, change some of the wording to be more Native specific or just appropriate culturally. An example, I think they had termination of the program, and I used exit instead, so just rewording that. What the rental assistance agreement really is it's just a documentation or document showing that we've kind of discussed how the rental subsidies look like, what is kind of expected of the participants, so the lease has to be in their name, they're responsible for their portion of the rent and things like that. So that's just one way that we keep that documented. We also have, because we help with the security deposit, we have a security deposit agreement form. So each time that we help a participant with a security deposit, we have a form that's basically just asking the landlord or the apartment complex to, upon returning the security deposit, could you please get that to us, and the address and those type of things. And that's just a way to just show that we are trying to get our security deposit back. That, as we know, in our community, very rarely does anybody get their security deposit back, but it's just a way that we have stating that we would like to get that back. Grievance procedure, we have that as well, so kind of just laying out the structure and how a participant would file a grievance. If that happens, this is kind of the process. So we have that. We also have a contact information form. So if we are having a hard time reaching out to a participant just due to safety, what are some additional contacts, whether it be a friend, a parent, a sister, something like that. We have that on file. And then we have an intake housing plan, or the intake. And so that's, once they are approved into the transitional housing program, there is an intake, and that kind of documents their housing plan. So if they're a family of 4 or more, then their subsidy will look like they get $500 for the first 3 months, and then it goes down to $400, and so on, and that kind of documents that. It also has family information, so who's staying in that house. That kind of justifies the rental subsidy, but it also provides information for our report. We need all of that information in our transitional housing report, the gender, the age of the children, and so that's a way to get that information. And of course, all of it's voluntary. If they don't have to answer some of these questions, or these questions if they've, it always says it's optional. For kind of those demographic breakdowns. Breakdown of subsidies, income, and sources. We don't really verify the income, but we just have that, to guide our work as advocates. And then just information that's saying, the lease will be in your name, and all of those things. So that's kind of what the intake form looks like. And those are really just kind of the forms that we have to help with our documentation. So if you would like access to that, or if you want to use that as a template, please feel free to email me or reach out to Vicki if you have any specific grant questions. We can definitely send those out to you. And so just I think the key pieces here are, supporting confidentiality and supporting grant compliance, really, for the documentation, and how you're doing that in your program, just to ensure that you are, in fact, keeping up with documentation and complying, as well as being confidential. So I guess we can leave it open for questions. Novi? I don't know.
As a reminder, you can raise the hand button in the corner or type it in the chat.
And definitely if you, yes, you can, if you have additional information, yes, you can send an email to me, absolutely. And definitely, if you have things that really work for you, I think just sharing and growing, I think, transitional housing programs look different. So just really thinking about what works for you, and if you have things to share as well and you find that are really great, I would love to see that too. Just because we are a new program as well, and just more information, the better. And if you find that some forms aren't working, just email me. Absolutely. And then my extension, I believe, is, I don't even think I have my extension, but when you call that number 833-719-9463, there should be an option if you want to call me as well. That is a great way to reach me.
All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. I hope some of it was very helpful. So, and thanks, Alicia, very much, and Hanovi. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So before we end the call, we want to let you know about our upcoming webinar, which is Two-Spirit LGBTQ Policies and Practices within your Tribal Transitional Housing Program, which will be hosted by Lenny Hayes on October 24th. We are rescheduling historical trauma and its impact on Two-Spirit LGBTQ participants, and we'll send out an email on its new date. We'd also like to mention that we will be sending out an email link to a survey on today's presentation. And with that said, I'd like to thank our presenter, Raquel, our host, Alicia from THTA, and all of you for joining us. And we hope to see you at our next webinar.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.